80-year-old Samuel Carter pushed a small fruit cart through the streets of Charleston every morning, selling apples and oranges just to buy medicine for his sick wife. Life was quiet and difficult until one rainy day his cart accidentally scraped the luxury car of a wealthy white woman. What could have been forgiven quickly turned into humiliation, harsh accusations, and a demand for money the old man could never pay. As the case reached the courtroom, the crowd expected the law to crush him, until one unexpected voice changed everything. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Charleston, South Carolina woke under a pale gray sky and a thin veil of sea mist drifting in from the harbor. The morning air was cool, salted, and damp, carrying the cries of gulls above the old brick streets and the faint rattle of delivery trucks heading toward the market. The city was not yet fully awake, but the day had already begun for the people who lived by labor rather than comfort. Samuel Carter was always one of the first to rise. At 80 years old, Samuel was a thin black man with narrow shoulders, long arms, and a back that had slowly bent under the weight of years, weather, and work. His face was lined deeply, not only by age but by endurance. His skin was a rich, deep brown, worn soft by sun and wind, and his cheekbones stood high above hollow cheeks. He had short, silver-gray hair, clipped close because it was easier that way, and tired, dark eyes that still carried kindness even on the hardest mornings. He moved carefully, never wasting energy, never complaining out loud. There was a quiet dignity about him, the kind that came from surviving without becoming bitter. Samuel spoke gently to everyone, even to people who did not deserve gentleness. He had once been stronger, broader, faster. Years earlier he had worked at the port, loading shipments, then later in warehouse jobs and maintenance work, taking whatever honest labor he could find. But age had taken his strength in pieces, and illness had taken what little savings he and his wife had managed to keep. His wife, Lillian Carter, lay awake in the small bedroom as he buttoned his faded work shirt near the kitchen window. Lillian was 78, small-boned and elegant even in pain. Time had thinned her body until she seemed almost delicate beneath the blankets, but there was still grace in the shape of her face and in the careful way she carried herself when she could stand. Her skin, a warm, deep brown touched with fine age lines, had once glowed with the energy of a woman who never sat still. Her hair was silver now, soft and pulled back into a neat low wrap when she had the strength to fix it. Her eyes were dark and intelligent, and though pain often clouded them, they had not lost their tenderness. Severe arthritis had settled deep into her joints over the past decade, twisting her hands, stiffening her knees, and turning simple movements into quiet battles. Before sickness began to claim more of her days, Lillian had been known in their neighborhood as a woman of patience and order, a church volunteer who remembered birthdays, brought soup to grieving families, and pressed clean collars with almost sacred care. She had never been loud, but she had always been steady. Illness had not changed her kindness, only forced it into a smaller space. "You're up too early again," she said softly, watching him reach for his old jacket. Samuel gave her the small smile he saved for mornings when the truth would do no good. "Market won't wait for me just because the sun is feeling lazy." She tried to smile back. "You make sure that wheel holds today." "I checked it last night." "You checked it like a man who wanted to sleep." That made him chuckle under his breath. Their house was little more than a weathered one-story structure with peeling paint and a porch that dipped slightly to one side. It stood in a tired neighborhood where most people kept going because stopping was a luxury. The kitchen was narrow. The cabinets were old. The refrigerator hummed louder than it should, but everything was clean. Lillian insisted on that, even now. Samuel had learned to move through the house with the quiet rhythm of someone who understood illness intimately. Where to place the medicine bottle, how to warm water without waking her, how to fold a blanket so it would not rub against aching knees. He poured her tea, set out 2 tablets beside it, then tied a cloth around a basket of apples that he would take with him. On the counter lay a folded notepad with numbers written in pencil. Rent, electricity, medicine, groceries, every figure mattered. Every dollar had a place before it had even been earned. Outside in the narrow side yard stood Samuel's fruit cart. It was an old wooden cart with iron-rimmed wheels, repaired so many times that almost no original part remained untouched. The handles had been wrapped with cloth to protect his palms. One side panel sat slightly crooked. The left wheel gave a stubborn squeak unless he oiled it often. Yet Samuel cared for it like some men cared for prized tools or family heirlooms. It was not beautiful, but it was faithful. He loaded the fruit slowly, arranging it with the care of a shopkeeper who still believed presentation mattered. Red apples in one crate, oranges in another, peaches, soft with color, placed near the front where morning light would catch them. He did not sell much, not compared to larger vendors with trucks and permits and bigger inventories. But Samuel understood something they often forgot. People liked buying from a man who treated even cheap fruit with respect. Before leaving, he returned to the bedroom door. "I'll be back before the afternoon heat settles in." Lillian looked at him for a long moment. "Don't skip lunch. I've got half a sandwich." "That is not lunch. That is evidence." He laughed again, more quietly this time. Then he crossed the room, bent with effort, and kissed her forehead. The road to the market was not long, but it was long enough for an old man pulling weight. Charleston's streets shifted around him as the morning brightened. Delivery vans rolled past. Shopkeepers unlocked doors. Church bells sounded faintly across the district. The closer Samuel came to the harbor, the more the city changed its smell from wet brick and gasoline to tidewater and fish. He walked at a measured pace, both hands gripping the cart, shoulders leaning forward with practiced determination. The market near the port was small, crowded, and imperfect. That was why Samuel liked it. It belonged to working people. To immigrants, widows, fishermen, bakers, men with rough hands, and women with sharp eyes. Not everyone there was kind, but almost everyone there understood struggle. Maria Lopez saw him first. Maria was a woman in her early 50s, short and sturdy, with warm brown skin, dark curly hair always tied back in a red scarf, and a face that seemed made for expression. Her eyes were lively, observant, and quick to soften when she saw pain in someone else. She ran a small bread stall near the corner, selling conchas, sweet rolls, and loaves that filled the morning with the smell of yeast and butter. Maria had come to Charleston years earlier from San Antonio after her husband died, bringing little except recipes and stubbornness. Hardship had sharpened her but not hardened her. She had a way of speaking that sounded half like teasing and half like prayer. "Samuel Carter," she called, hands on her hips. "You beat the gulls again." "Somebody has to remind them this is still a city," Samuel said. Maria laughed, then reached beneath a cloth and pulled out a small, warm roll. "For breakfast. Don't insult me by pretending you ate." "I had coffee." "Coffee is not breakfast. Coffee is a warning." He accepted the roll with gratitude he did not try to hide. "I'll pay you tomorrow." "No, you won't, because tomorrow I'll hand you another one." A few stalls down stood Tom Henderson, dragging crates of ice toward his fish counter. Tom was a white man in his 60s with broad shoulders, thick hands, a rough red face weathered by sea air, and thinning sandy hair under a faded cap. He had the heavy walk of someone whose knees had taken punishment from decades on docks and boats. At first glance, he seemed stern, even unfriendly, but most people in the market knew better. Tom spoke sparingly and cursed at broken equipment with great conviction, yet he helped without making a show of it. His wife had died years earlier, and since then he had grown even quieter, though certain griefs had made him gentler toward other people's burdens. He glanced at Samuel's cart and grunted. "Hill gave you trouble?" "Not today. Means it's waiting to surprise you later." Tom stepped over without another word and lifted one end of the cart to help Samuel angle it into the usual spot. He did this nearly every morning, always pretending it was about efficiency rather than kindness. By 8 o'clock, the market had found its rhythm. Customers wandered through with canvas bags and coffee cups. Samuel sold 2 apples to a woman with a toddler, then a bag of oranges to an older man from the marina. He wrapped the fruit in brown paper, counted change carefully, and thanked everyone as if they had done him a personal favor. He knew many customers by habit, if not by name. Some came because his prices were fair, some came because he never rushed them. Some came because his face reminded them of fathers and uncles and grandfathers who had worked too long and asked too little. Around mid-morning, a young man crossed the far edge of the market carrying a satchel full of books. That was Daniel Brooks. Daniel was 24, tall and lean, with light brown skin, close-cropped black hair, and thoughtful dark eyes that missed very little. He dressed simply in clean shirts, worn jackets, and practical shoes, the uniform of a student who measured money carefully. There was intelligence in his face, but also restraint. He was not the type to fill space with noise. Daniel had grown up in a working-class neighborhood outside Columbia, raised mostly by his mother after his father left when he was young. Watching her balance 2 jobs while fighting landlords, paperwork, and systems that rarely favored people like them had shaped him early. It was one of the reasons he had chosen law. He wanted to understand the language that so often decided who suffered and who was protected. He passed through the market several times a week on his way to classes and internships. He had noticed Samuel before, the old fruit seller with the careful hands and the uncomplaining face. They had never spoken, but Daniel had nodded at him once or twice, and Samuel had nodded back. This morning, Daniel slowed for half a second, enough to watch Samuel help a little girl choose the reddest apple from the crate. Then he kept walking. Samuel did not know his name. He only noticed that the young man always looked as though he was thinking about something heavier than books. By noon, the sky had cleared into a pale blue, and sunlight warmed the market roofs. Samuel counted his earnings in private when no one was watching. Not much, but not terrible. Enough for bread, perhaps enough for medicine if the afternoon went well. He sat on an overturned crate and ate the remaining half of his sandwich. Maria slipped him a second roll when she thought he was not looking. Tom shouted at a supplier over the quality of shrimp. Somewhere near the harbor, a radio played old soul music through static. Life in all its worn and modest pieces moved forward, and in that small, ordinary day, Samuel felt something close to peace. He did not dream of miracles. He did not ask heaven for wealth. He did not envy men with easier lives. He only wanted one thing: enough. Enough money for Lillian's tablets, enough strength to push the cart tomorrow, enough time for one more quiet evening at home with the woman who had shared every season of hardship beside him. As the afternoon light tilted over Charleston and turned the edges of the market gold, Samuel packed the unsold peaches more carefully than the rest. Lillian liked peaches when her appetite returned. He smiled to himself at that thought. Tomorrow, he told himself, if the weather held, he might sell enough to bring home a little extra. He did not know that before another day had passed, the fragile balance of his life would begin to break. The next morning, Charleston woke beneath a light gray rain that seemed to hang quietly over the city rather than fall. The streets near the harbor were slick with water, and the old cobblestones glistened beneath the dim early light. A thin mist drifted in from the Atlantic, carrying the smell of salt and damp wood through the narrow streets. It was the kind of morning when most people hurried indoors, pulling jackets tight and keeping their heads down. But for people like Samuel Carter, work did not pause simply because the sky decided to cry a little. Samuel had left his small house earlier than usual, hoping to reach the market before the rain grew heavier. His worn brown jacket hung loosely on his thin frame, and the collar was turned up to protect his neck from the drizzle. The old fruit cart rolled slowly in front of him, its wooden frame damp and darkened by the rain. The wheels creaked softly as they turned, and every few steps Samuel leaned his weight forward to keep the cart steady over the uneven road. Inside the cart were the same simple treasures he carried each day: red apples polished with a cloth, bright oranges stacked in careful rows, and a small crate of peaches whose sweet smell rose faintly even through the wet morning air. He had woken before sunrise to wipe each fruit dry and arrange them neatly. Even after so many years of doing this, Samuel still believed that fruit should look welcoming, like it was waiting for someone who needed a small kindness in their day. His mind wandered briefly to Lillian. Before leaving, he had checked the small bottle of medicine beside her bed. Only a few tablets remained. That thought had followed him all the way down the street like a quiet shadow. The road that led to the market curved through a narrow side street lined with parked cars and small brick storefronts that were still closed for the morning. Rainwater collected in shallow puddles along the curb. Samuel walked carefully, pushing the cart around a bend where a rusted drain cover sat half-hidden beneath a thin layer of water. He had passed that drain hundreds of times before. This morning, however, the street was slick. As the front wheel of the cart rolled over the metal cover, it caught suddenly in a narrow gap where the iron had shifted slightly from years of wear. The cart jerked hard to the left. Samuel's tired arms tightened around the handles as he tried to steady it, but his balance was slower than the sudden movement. The cart tipped. The right wheel lifted slightly off the ground, and before Samuel could correct the motion, the entire cart rolled sideways toward the curb. At that exact moment, a sleek silver sedan sat parked along the edge of the street, its polished surface reflecting the gray sky. The wooden side of the cart scraped lightly along the side door of the car. The sound was small but sharp. Wood against metal. Samuel froze. For a moment there was only the quiet sound of rain tapping against the pavement. Then the cart tipped enough for several apples to tumble free. They rolled across the wet road, bouncing slowly before settling in the shallow puddles. The door of the sedan swung open. Out stepped Victoria Langford. Victoria Langford was 34 years old, tall and sharply poised, with the kind of posture that suggested she had spent her entire life expecting rooms to notice when she entered them. Her hair was a smooth shade of golden blonde, styled carefully so that even the rain seemed reluctant to disturb it. Her skin was pale and flawless, her jawline clean and confident, and her light blue eyes carried a cold focus that made people feel examined rather than greeted. She wore a long beige trench coat over an expensive black dress, and sleek, high-heeled boots clicked sharply against the pavement as she stepped out of the car. Victoria worked as a real estate executive in one of Charleston's most aggressive property firms. She had built her career through relentless ambition and a reputation for winning negotiations others considered impossible. Years earlier, during the collapse of the housing market, she had learned quickly that hesitation cost money. Since then, she had developed a personality that valued control, efficiency, and status above nearly everything else. Compassion was not something that had helped her rise in business, and over time it had simply faded from her priorities. Her eyes moved immediately to the faint scrape across the side of her car, then to the apples scattered across the street, then to the thin old man standing beside the crooked cart. "What did you do?" she demanded. Her voice cut sharply through the quiet street. Samuel removed his cap, slowly, rain dampening his silver hair. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said softly. The wheel caught in the drain. Victoria stepped closer to the car and ran her fingers across the scratch. It was not deep, but it was visible. The thin mark stretched along the polished door like a careless signature. Her face hardened. "Do you have any idea what this car costs?" Samuel lowered his eyes. "I didn't mean to damage it." "That's not the point." More apples rolled quietly along the street as rainwater pushed them slowly toward the curb. By now, the raised voices had begun to attract attention. A man from a nearby vegetable stand hurried over first. His name was Jake Miller. Jake Miller was 26, tall and lanky, with sandy brown hair that rarely stayed neat, and a face that carried a permanent expression of curious concern. His hands were rough from lifting crates of produce every day, and his clothes always smelled faintly of soil and fresh vegetables. Jake had grown up on a small farm outside Charleston where drought and bad harvests had taught him early that life could turn against you without warning. That experience had made him instinctively sympathetic to people who struggled. He was not confrontational by nature, but he believed deeply that unfairness should not be ignored. He stopped a few feet away, taking in the scene. "You okay, Mr. Carter?" he asked. Samuel nodded quietly. Victoria turned toward Jake with clear irritation. "Do you know this man?" "He sells fruit at the market," Jake said. "Good guy." Victoria folded her arms. "Well, your good guy just scratched my car." Jake glanced at the small scrape. "Looks pretty light." Her eyes narrowed. "This is a luxury vehicle." Jake opened his mouth as if to respond, then hesitated. Instead, he quietly pulled out his phone. He pressed the record button. Victoria did not notice. Meanwhile, 2 other vendors from the market had begun to gather near the sidewalk, whispering among themselves as they bent to pick up the fallen apples. Samuel crouched slowly and tried to collect them too, his stiff joints protesting the movement. The rain soaked through his jacket as he reached for each piece of fruit. Victoria watched him for a moment, her expression unmoved. Then she spoke again. "You're going to pay for this." Samuel looked up in quiet disbelief. "Ma'am, I sell fruit. I don't have that kind of money." "That's not my problem." Her voice was calm now, colder than before. "I will have the damage assessed, and you will compensate me." Jake lowered the phone slightly but kept recording. "How much damage are we talking about?" he asked carefully. Victoria glanced at the car again. A full repaint and repair could easily cost $20,000. The number hung in the air like thunder. Samuel's shoulders sagged slightly. $20,000 might as well have been the distance to the moon. "That's impossible," Jake muttered under his breath. Victoria ignored him. "If you cannot pay," she continued, "then we will settle this in court." The small crowd fell silent. The rain continued to fall softly around them. Samuel stood slowly, holding 2 wet apples in his trembling hands. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he lowered his head. "I understand." Jake looked stunned. "You can't just—" Samuel gently placed the apples back into the cart. "It was my cart that touched the car," he said quietly. Victoria gave a satisfied nod. "Then we'll see each other in court." She stepped back into the sedan, closed the door firmly, and started the engine. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the scattered fruit, the stunned market vendors, and an old man standing beside a crooked wooden cart in the rain. Jake slowly lowered his phone. Samuel remained still for a moment longer. Then he bent down again and continued picking up the apples. The rain stopped sometime in the late afternoon, but the tension it left behind lingered in the Charleston market long after the clouds drifted away. By the next morning, the story had already traveled through every stall, every vendor truck, and nearly every customer who passed through the narrow aisles between produce tables and fish counters. Markets were places where news moved quickly. A single argument could travel faster than any newspaper headline. Samuel Carter arrived later than usual that morning. His old fruit cart rolled slowly into its familiar corner near the edge of the market square, the wooden wheels squeaking faintly against the pavement. His shoulders seemed slightly more bent than the day before, and the lines in his weathered face appeared deeper, as if the events of the previous morning had quietly settled into his bones overnight. His dark eyes remained calm, but there was a heaviness behind them now, the quiet weight of a man who understood that trouble had already begun moving toward him, even if it had not yet arrived fully. A few vendors glanced up when they saw him. Some offered sympathetic nods. Others looked away. Markets were honest places, but honesty did not always mean kindness. Some people believed compassion should guide decisions. Others believed rules existed for a reason, no matter who suffered under them. Maria Lopez stood behind her bread stall kneading dough when Samuel arrived. She was already up to her elbows in flour, her red scarf tied tightly around her dark curls, and the warm smell of fresh bread filled the air around her stand. When she spotted Samuel pushing the cart toward his usual spot, her hands froze for a moment in the bowl. "Samuel," she called, her voice softer than usual. Samuel gave a small nod. "Morning, Maria." She stepped out from behind the stall, wiping her hands on a cloth. "I heard what happened." Samuel set the brake on his cart and began arranging his apples in quiet silence. "It was an accident." Maria's brown eyes flashed with frustration. "Everybody knows that." Not far away, Tom Henderson leaned against the side of his fish stall, arms crossed as he watched the conversation. The older fisherman had heard the story the night before from another vendor who had witnessed the argument. Tom's thick gray beard twitched slightly as he listened to the murmuring voices around the market. He walked over slowly, his heavy boots thudding against the pavement. "That woman serious about suing?" Tom asked. Samuel hesitated before answering. "She said she would take it to court." Tom let out a low whistle. "Over a scratch?" Samuel shrugged faintly. "I suppose it matters to her." By mid-morning, the market had fully woken, and the discussions became louder. At the vegetable stall near the center aisle, Jake Miller stood beside several wooden crates of tomatoes and peppers. He had barely slept the night before. The video he had recorded of the incident sat in his phone like a small burning weight in his pocket. Jake had replayed it several times, each time feeling more uneasy about what he had witnessed. The image of the old man standing silently in the rain while apples rolled across the pavement had stuck with him. A few vendors gathered around his stall. One of them was Carl Donnelly, a middle-aged man with a thick neck and a permanently skeptical expression. Carl sold smoked meats from a refrigerated truck and had built a reputation for being blunt, sometimes painfully so. His broad face and shaved head gave him an intimidating presence, and he had little patience for what he considered sentimentality. Carl folded his arms. Well, if the cart scratched the car, then the old man's responsible. Jake frowned. "You saw the video." "Doesn't matter. Damage is damage." Another vendor, a thin woman named Evelyn Price, shook her head. Evelyn was in her late 60s, tall and narrow-shouldered with short silver hair and kind gray eyes that seemed permanently tired but still alert. She ran a small herb stand and had spent most of her life selling medicinal plants and teas to locals. Evelyn believed strongly that people should be judged not just by rules but by circumstances. "That woman could have let it go," she said quietly. Carl snorted. "Maybe, but the law doesn't run on feelings." The argument continued, and within an hour, the market had quietly divided into two camps. Some people felt Samuel deserved protection. Others believed the situation was simply the consequence of an accident. Maria and Tom watched the growing tension with concern. By noon, Maria made a decision. She placed a small glass jar on the corner of her bread stall and taped a piece of paper to it. "Help Samuel." The handwriting was large and uneven. Tom saw the jar and nodded approvingly. Without saying a word, he walked back to his stall, reached into the cash box beneath the counter, and dropped a folded $20 bill into the jar as he passed. Maria smiled faintly. Customers began to notice. Some dropped a few dollars inside, others walked past without looking. By late afternoon, the jar held a small stack of bills and several coins. It was kind, but it was nowhere near enough. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel Brooks sat at a small wooden table inside the university library. The law building at the College of Charleston was quiet that afternoon, filled mostly with students hunched over textbooks and laptops. Daniel had come to study constitutional law, but his attention kept drifting back to the video Jake Miller had sent him earlier that day. Jake and Daniel knew each other only casually. They had met several months earlier when Daniel stopped by the vegetable stall to buy tomatoes, and the two had occasionally exchanged brief conversations since then. That morning, Jake had approached him outside the market. "You're studying law, right?" Jake had asked. Daniel had nodded. Jake handed him his phone. "Then you might want to see this." Now, Daniel watched the video again. The clip was short. It showed Samuel's cart tipping slightly as the wheel caught in the drain. It showed the apples rolling across the wet pavement. It showed the woman stepping out of the car. Daniel paused the video at the moment Samuel removed his cap and lowered his head. Something about that small gesture stayed with him. Daniel leaned back in his chair. At 24 years old, he carried the quiet seriousness of someone who had grown up watching injustice operate in subtle ways. His mother had worked long hours as a nurse's assistant, and he had spent much of his childhood learning how systems often failed the people who needed them most. That was part of the reason he had chosen law, not because he believed it could fix everything, but because he believed understanding the rules might give him a chance to challenge them when necessary. He opened his laptop and began searching public court records. It did not take long to find the preliminary filing. Victoria Langford had already contacted a lawyer. The estimated damage claim was nearly $20,000. Daniel read the documents carefully. Then his brow furrowed. There was no defense attorney listed. Samuel Carter had no legal representation. Daniel closed the laptop slowly. Across town, Samuel returned home just before evening. The sky had turned orange above the rooftops, and the quiet neighborhood smelled faintly of wet asphalt and cooking food drifting from open windows. Inside the small house, Lillian Carter sat upright in her bed, her thin hands folded carefully in her lap. Her silver hair had been brushed neatly back, but the strain in her face was difficult to hide. She had learned about the accident that afternoon when Maria stopped by with bread. Samuel paused in the doorway when he saw her expression. "You heard," he said gently. Lillian nodded. Her voice was calm, but her fingers trembled slightly. "They said she's taking you to court." Samuel set the small bag of fruit on the kitchen table. "I'll handle it." "You can't pay that kind of money." He did not answer. Lillian slowly reached for his hand. "You've carried enough in this life," she said quietly. Samuel smiled, though it was a tired smile. "Then I'll carry this too." Outside, the evening grew darker. Inside the small house, the old fruit seller sat beside his wife, the weight of the coming days settling quietly between them. The Charleston County Courthouse stood at the end of a broad stone plaza, where the morning wind carried the smell of the nearby harbor. The building itself was tall and solemn, built of pale limestone that seemed almost white beneath the soft southern sunlight. Large columns framed the entrance, giving the place a quiet authority that reminded visitors the law was meant to stand above ordinary life. On the morning of the hearing, the steps were busy with people entering and leaving. Lawyers carrying leather folders, clerks holding stacks of paperwork, and citizens waiting nervously for their own cases to be called. Samuel Carter climbed those steps slowly. He wore the same brown coat he had owned for years. The coat had once been sturdy, but now showed the fatigue of time. Thin cuffs, faded fabric, and a seam that had been carefully stitched back together by Lillian months earlier. Samuel had polished his shoes as best he could the night before, though the leather still showed its age. He carried no briefcase, no folder of legal documents, only a quiet dignity that had followed him through every hardship of his life. Inside the courthouse hallway, the air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of paper and old wood. The floors were polished stone that echoed softly beneath every footstep. Samuel paused near a long wooden bench where several other people waited. Across the hall stood Victoria Langford. She looked very different from the morning of the accident. Today, she wore a sharply tailored navy suit that fit her tall frame perfectly. Her blonde hair had been styled into a smooth, shoulder-length cut, and a pair of thin silver earrings caught the light when she turned her head. In one hand, she held a leather portfolio, and beside her stood her attorney, a man whose posture suggested years of professional confidence. His name was Richard Caldwell. Richard Caldwell was a well-known civil attorney in Charleston, a man in his late 50s with neatly combed gray hair and a face that carried the calm certainty of someone who had spent decades arguing inside courtrooms. He had a tall, straight build and sharp blue eyes that missed very little. Caldwell had built his reputation representing wealthy clients in property disputes and financial claims, and his manner was polite but distant, as though most people existed only as details in the cases he handled. He spoke quietly, but when he did, others listened. Victoria leaned toward him as they reviewed the documents in her folder. "Everything is prepared?" she asked. Caldwell nodded. "The repair estimate is clear. The liability is straightforward." Victoria crossed her arms lightly. "Good." She glanced briefly across the hallway. Samuel stood alone on the bench, hands resting quietly in his lap. He did not look at her. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was quiet but tense. Rows of wooden benches faced the judge's bench at the front of the room. Tall windows allowed thin beams of morning sunlight to stretch across the polished floor. The American flag stood near the wall beside the judge's seat, unmoving in the still air. Several people from the market had come. Maria Lopez sat in the second row, her red scarf tied tightly around her hair as usual, though today her hands rested nervously in her lap rather than kneading bread. She had closed her stall early that morning so she could attend the hearing. Next to her sat Tom Henderson. The broad fisherman looked uncomfortable in a courthouse setting. His thick hands rested on his knees, and his expression carried the quiet frustration of someone who believed common sense should solve problems faster than legal procedures. Jake Miller sat a few seats away, his phone tucked into his jacket pocket. His restless gaze moved between Samuel and Victoria as the room slowly filled. At exactly 9 o'clock, the courtroom door opened behind the judge's bench. Judge Harold Whitman entered. Judge Whitman was 63 years old, tall with a dignified posture that made him appear slightly taller than he actually was. His hair was silver gray, neatly combed to the side, and his pale face carried the thoughtful lines of someone who had spent years listening carefully before speaking. His blue-gray eyes were calm but penetrating, the kind that could study a room without raising his voice. Those who worked regularly in the courthouse knew Whitman as a man who valued fairness above speed. He was not easily impressed, and he was not easily persuaded by emotional arguments alone. The courtroom rose as he took his seat. "Be seated," he said in a measured voice. The case was called. Langford versus Carter. Samuel stood slowly from the defense table. His movements were careful, deliberate. Across the aisle, Victoria and her attorney stood as well. Richard Caldwell began presenting the case with professional efficiency. He described the incident calmly, referring to the written repair estimates and photographs of the vehicle damage. Large printed images were displayed briefly for the court, clear pictures of the silver sedan and the visible scrape along the door panel. The repair process involves repainting and refinishing the entire door section, Caldwell explained, as well as restoring the vehicle's factory finish. The estimated cost is approximately $20,000. Judge Whitman studied the documents. His voice remained neutral. "And the defendant?" Caldwell gestured toward Samuel. "Mr. Carter has acknowledged that his fruit cart made contact with the vehicle." The judge turned his attention to Samuel. "Mr. Carter, is that correct?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was gentle, almost apologetic. Judge Whitman leaned back slightly in his chair. "You understand that under civil law, damage caused to private property must be compensated by the responsible party." Samuel lowered his eyes. "I understand." Victoria watched silently, her expression composed. Judge Whitman paused before continuing. "However," he said carefully, "the court may consider mediation if both parties are willing to reach a reasonable settlement outside full liability." He looked toward Victoria. "Miss Langford, would you be open to mediation?" Victoria's response came immediately. "No, Your Honor." The firmness in her voice echoed across the quiet room. Judge Whitman studied her expression. "May I ask why?" Victoria straightened slightly. "Because the damage was caused by negligence. If people are allowed to avoid responsibility simply because they claim hardship, then accountability becomes meaningless." A murmur moved quietly through the courtroom benches. Maria frowned. Tom shifted in his seat. Victoria continued speaking. "Property damage is property damage. My car was legally parked. His cart struck it. The situation is clear." Her tone remained controlled, but something sharper lay beneath the words. Jake Miller felt his jaw tighten. The judge remained calm. He turned his attention back to Samuel. "Mr. Carter, would you like to explain the circumstances of the incident?" Samuel hesitated. The courtroom waited. Finally, he spoke. "The wheel of my cart caught in a drain cover," he said quietly. "The street was wet. I tried to hold it, but it slipped." Judge Whitman nodded slowly. "And what do you do for work, Mr. Carter?" Samuel's answer was simple. "I sell fruit at the market." The judge watched him carefully. Samuel continued softly, "I sell apples and oranges mostly." Whitman leaned forward slightly. "And why do you continue working at your age?" Samuel paused before answering. Then he spoke the sentence that seemed to settle heavily over the room. "I sell fruit to buy medicine for my wife." The words were not dramatic. They were not spoken loudly, but their honesty filled the courtroom with silence. Judge Whitman remained quiet for several seconds. Then he turned back toward Victoria. "The court again recommends mediation," he said calmly. Victoria shook her head. "I decline." Something in her tone, perhaps the faint edge of disdain, perhaps the quiet suggestion that some people simply mattered less, caused the room to grow noticeably colder. No one spoke. Even the air seemed heavier. Judge Whitman closed the folder of documents slowly. "Very well," he said, and the courtroom waited for what would come next. The courtroom remained silent after Judge Harold Whitman closed the folder of documents on his bench. The stillness in the room felt heavy, like a storm that had not yet broken but was already hanging low in the air. The tall windows along the courtroom walls allowed soft daylight to spill across the polished wooden floor, but the light did little to ease the tension sitting between the people inside the room. Samuel Carter stood quietly at the defense table. His hands rested gently on the edge of the wooden surface, the veins along his thin fingers visible beneath the dark skin worn by decades of work. His brown coat, faded and carefully mended, seemed even older beneath the bright courtroom lights. Yet Samuel did not appear ashamed. He simply looked tired, the way a man looks when life has already asked more from him than he thought he could give. Across the aisle, Victoria Langford remained perfectly composed. Her posture was straight, her chin slightly raised, her expression cool and confident. The navy suit she wore fit her tall figure sharply, the fabric crisp and elegant. Her pale blue eyes moved across the room with quiet impatience, as if she believed the entire process was taking longer than it should. Beside her, Attorney Richard Caldwell stood calmly, with both hands resting on the table, his legal documents neatly arranged before him. The experienced lawyer had already begun preparing for the likely outcome. In his mind, the law was clear. The defendant had admitted responsibility. The financial damages had been documented. There was very little left to debate. Judge Whitman cleared his throat softly. "Based on the evidence presented," he began carefully, "the court must consider the responsibility of the defendant in the matter of property damage." Samuel nodded once. He had already accepted that truth. Behind him, the benches were filled with quiet observers. Maria Lopez sat with both hands clasped together in her lap, her fingers twisting slightly as she listened. The normally warm and energetic Baker looked anxious, her dark eyes shifting between Samuel and the judge. Tom Henderson sat beside her, his large frame stiff with frustration. The fisherman's thick hands gripped the wooden bench as if the wood itself were responsible for the situation unfolding before him. Jake Miller leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. His sandy hair fell loosely across his forehead as he watched the judge, his jaw tight with worry. Several other members of the public sat scattered across the courtroom. Some were there for their own hearings later in the day. Others had heard about the unusual case involving the old fruit seller and had come simply to see how it would end. Among them sat Daniel Brooks. Daniel had taken a seat in the third row, slightly off to the side. His posture was relaxed but attentive, his dark eyes focused quietly on the front of the room. He wore a simple gray blazer over a white shirt, and a canvas satchel rested at his feet filled with law textbooks and notebooks. To most people in the room, he appeared to be just another student observing a legal process. But Daniel's mind had been working steadily since the moment the hearing began. The video Jake had shown him days earlier had already planted something inside him. Watching Samuel stand silently under accusation had stirred memories Daniel knew well. The look of someone who had learned long ago that arguing with certain systems rarely changed the outcome. Daniel had seen that look before. He had seen it on his mother's face when landlords ignored complaints. He had seen it on neighbors who worked 2 jobs yet still struggled to survive. He had seen it on people who knew the law existed but did not believe it would ever protect them. Judge Whitman continued speaking. Under civil law, the defendant may be held financially responsible for the repair costs associated with the plaintiff's vehicle. Maria lowered her head slightly. Tom exhaled heavily through his nose. Samuel remained still. The judge paused briefly, glancing at the papers before him. At that moment, a chair scraped softly against the courtroom floor. The sound was small, but in the silence it carried clearly. Daniel Brooks stood up. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Judge Whitman lifted his eyes from the documents with quiet curiosity. Daniel stepped forward slightly from the row of benches. He was tall and lean, with the steady posture of someone who had spent years learning to observe before acting. His expression was calm, but there was determination in his gaze. "Your Honor," he said respectfully. The judge studied him. "Yes?" Daniel spoke clearly. "My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm a law student here in Charleston." A few people in the courtroom shifted in their seats. Daniel continued. "I have been following this case, and I would like to make a statement." Victoria Langford turned slightly, clearly irritated by the interruption. Judge Whitman considered the young man for a moment. "Proceed." Daniel took one step closer to the front. "I would like to offer payment for the damages claimed by Miss Langford," he said. The words seemed to hang in the air. For several seconds, no one moved. Maria blinked in surprise. Tom's eyes widened slightly. Jake Miller leaned forward in disbelief. Even Attorney Caldwell raised one eyebrow. Daniel continued calmly. "I will cover the full repair cost." A quiet murmur spread through the room. Samuel turned slowly. His tired eyes settled on the young man he had seen passing through the market so many times but had never spoken to. Judge Whitman's expression remained composed, though curiosity flickered briefly in his eyes. "You understand," the judge said carefully, "that the claim involves a substantial amount of money." "I do," Daniel replied, "and you have no legal obligation to do this." Daniel nodded once. "That's correct." "Then why would you choose to take responsibility for someone else's debt?" Daniel paused. His answer came quietly. "Not because I'm required to," he said, "but because I believe it's the right thing to do." The courtroom fell completely silent. Victoria Langford was the first to speak. "If the damages are paid in full," she said quickly, "then I have no further complaint." Her voice carried clear satisfaction. Attorney Caldwell leaned slightly toward her and whispered something under his breath. Victoria gave a brief nod. Judge Whitman looked at Daniel. "You understand the legal implications of your offer?" "Yes, Your Honor." The judge nodded slowly. "Very well." The tension in the room shifted almost instantly. Victoria gathered her documents and closed her portfolio with a smooth motion. As she stepped away from the table, her high heels clicked sharply against the floor. She paused briefly as she passed Samuel. Her pale blue eyes glanced down at the old man standing quietly beside the defense table. A faint smirk touched her lips. "You're lucky someone decided to rescue you," she said coolly. Then she walked toward the exit. The courtroom door closed behind her. For a moment, no one moved. Samuel remained standing where he was. Then, slowly, he turned toward Daniel. The old man stepped closer, his movements careful but steady. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke. "Son, I don't know what to say." Daniel offered a small, gentle smile. Samuel reached out and took the young man's hand with both of his. "I'll repay you," he said earnestly. "It may take time, but I will." Daniel shook his head softly. "You don't owe me anything?" Samuel looked confused. Daniel's smile remained calm. "I didn't do this so you could pay me back." Samuel's eyes filled slightly. "Then why?" Daniel shrugged lightly. "Because sometimes," he said quietly, "the right thing deserves a chance." Samuel stood there for a moment, unable to speak. The courtroom slowly began to empty around them. But for the first time since the accident, the heavy weight on Samuel Carter's shoulders felt just a little lighter. Charleston returned to its ordinary rhythm in the days after the courtroom hearing, But the story of the old fruit seller and the young man who stood up for him traveled much farther than the courthouse walls. Markets, cafes, barber shops, and small offices across the city began repeating the same quiet tale. An 80-year-old man who sold fruit to buy medicine for his wife, and a law student who had unexpectedly taken on a burden that was never his to carry. In a city where people often hurried past one another without knowing each other's stories, the event lingered like a reminder that kindness still had the power to surprise. Samuel Carter returned to the market 2 days after the trial. The morning air was warm and bright again, the harbor breeze pushing soft sunlight through the narrow streets. Samuel pushed his old wooden fruit cart as he always had, but the way people looked at him had changed. Some greeted him with gentle smiles. Others simply nodded in quiet respect. Samuel did not fully understand why the attention had grown so suddenly, but he accepted each greeting with the same humble warmth he had always shown. Maria Lopez noticed the difference first. Maria stood behind her bread stall as usual, her red scarf tied over her dark curls, her strong hands moving confidently through trays of fresh rolls and sweet pastries. When Samuel rolled his cart into its corner of the market, Maria stepped out from behind her stall and folded her arms across her apron. "Well," she said with a wide grin, "look who the whole city is talking about." Samuel gave a small embarrassed smile. "I wish they would talk about someone else." Maria shook her head. "Too late for that." Tom Henderson joined them moments later, carrying a bucket of crushed ice from his fish stall. The broad fisherman looked at Samuel carefully before setting the bucket down beside the cart. "You holding up all right?" Tom asked. Samuel nodded. "Better than I expected." Tom scratched his gray beard thoughtfully. "That young fellow did something big." Samuel's eyes softened. "Yes, he did." Across the market aisle, Jake Miller leaned against his vegetable stand and waved toward Samuel. Jake still looked like the same lanky young man with sandy hair and permanently dirt-stained hands. But the way he watched Samuel now carried a quiet satisfaction. The video he had recorded had been shared among several people after the trial, and it was that short recording that had allowed many residents of Charleston to see exactly what had happened that rainy morning. Because of that video, the story had begun to spread. One of the people who eventually saw it was Eleanor Price. Eleanor Price was a woman in her late 60s with short silver hair and calm gray eyes that seemed permanently thoughtful. She served as the director of a small nonprofit organization in Charleston called Harbor Community Aid, a group dedicated to helping elderly residents who struggled with housing, health care, and legal assistance. Eleanor had spent most of her life working quietly behind the scenes, helping people navigate systems that were often confusing and unforgiving. She had once been a social worker before founding the organization 15 years earlier, after witnessing too many elderly residents lose their homes because they did not know where to turn for help. When Eleanor heard the story of Samuel Carter, she did what she had done countless times before. She began asking questions. Within a week, she had spoken to Maria Lopez, Tom Henderson, and even Jake Miller. Each conversation painted the same picture: an elderly man who had spent years pushing a fruit cart through the streets simply to keep medicine on the table for his sick wife. Eleanor arranged a meeting with the Charleston Community Welfare Office. The office itself occupied a modest government building downtown, where social workers and administrators handled hundreds of cases every month. The supervisor who reviewed Samuel's situation was a tall, middle-aged man named Andrew Collins. Andrew Collins had a lean frame, a neatly trimmed beard beginning to gray at the edges, and the thoughtful expression of someone who had learned that rules alone rarely solved human problems. Though his job required paperwork and policy decisions, Andrew still believed deeply that government programs existed to serve people, not the other way around. After reviewing Samuel's case, Andrew leaned back in his chair. "This man should have been receiving support already," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. "Many people don't know how to apply." Andrew closed the folder. "Let's fix that." Within weeks, several changes began quietly reshaping Samuel and Lillian's life. First came medical support. The Charleston Health Assistance Program approved coverage for Lillian Carter's medications and treatments. A visiting nurse named Patricia Lane began stopping by the Carter home twice each week to help monitor Lillian's condition. Patricia was a woman in her early 40s with warm, brown eyes, a calm voice, and the patient manner of someone who had spent years caring for people whose bodies no longer moved easily. She had once worked in a hospital emergency ward before choosing community care because she believed healing often required time and attention that busy hospitals could not provide. Lillian noticed the difference within weeks. The new medication reduced the swelling in her joints, and the regular visits from Patricia helped her regain a small measure of strength. She could sit upright longer without pain, and sometimes she even managed to walk slowly across the living room using a wooden cane Samuel had carved years earlier. The second change came through housing support. With assistance from Harbor Community Aid and the City Council, small repairs were made to the Carter home. The cracked porch boards were replaced. The kitchen plumbing was fixed. A ramp was installed at the front entrance to make it easier for Lillian to move safely outside. Samuel stood quietly on the porch the day the workers finished. He ran his hand across the smooth wooden railing and shook his head in disbelief. "I never expected this," he murmured. But perhaps the most important change came at the market. Maria Lopez and Tom Henderson had been discussing the idea for several days. Samuel's old cart had served him well, but at his age, pushing heavy loads across Charleston's uneven streets was becoming dangerous. So one morning, Tom approached Samuel with a small grin. "Got something to show you." Together, they walked to an empty corner stall that had recently been vacated. The wooden counter had been freshly cleaned. A small striped awning hung above it to provide shade. Beneath the counter sat several new crates for fruit. Maria stood nearby with her arms crossed proudly. "What do you think?" she asked. Samuel looked confused. Tom shrugged casually. "Market manager agreed to let you use the space." Samuel stared at the stall. "I can't afford rent." Maria waved her hand dismissively. "First year's covered, community fund." Samuel's throat tightened. He stepped behind the counter slowly, resting his hands on the smooth wood. For the first time in many years, he would not need to push his cart through the streets. Word spread quickly that Samuel Carter now had a permanent fruit stand. Customers returned daily. Some bought apples. Some bought oranges. Many simply stopped by to shake his hand. And every now and then, Daniel Brooks appeared. The young law student usually arrived in the late afternoon, books tucked under one arm. He would walk through the market, greet Maria and Tom, then stop at Samuel's stall. "2 apples today," Daniel would say. Samuel would place the fruit in a small paper bag. Sometimes Daniel stayed to talk for a few minutes. Sometimes he simply nodded politely and continued toward the university. But every visit ended the same way. Samuel always tried to slip an extra apple into the bag, and Daniel always pretended not to notice. Back at home, Lillian Carter watched the changes with quiet gratitude. One evening, she sat beside the kitchen window, sunlight warming the room as Samuel returned from the market. "You're smiling more these days," she said gently. Samuel placed a small bag of peaches on the table. "I don't have to push the cart anymore." Lillian reached for his hand. "You carried us a long way already." Samuel squeezed her fingers softly. Outside, Charleston moved through another peaceful evening, and inside the small Carter home, the quiet kindness of strangers had begun turning hardship into something gentler. Several months passed in Charleston, and the season slowly shifted from the heavy warmth of late summer toward the cooler breezes of early autumn. The harbor air carried a softer scent now, and the sunlight that fell across the narrow streets seemed calmer, gentler somehow. Life in the market had settled into a comfortable rhythm again, the kind of steady routine that working people often depended on more than anything else. Samuel Carter's fruit stand had quietly become part of that rhythm. The small stall stood beneath the striped awning Maria and Tom had helped install months earlier. Wooden crates filled with bright apples, oranges, peaches, and sometimes pears were arranged neatly across the counter each morning. Samuel arrived before sunrise most days, carefully wiping each fruit with a clean cloth and setting them in tidy rows. His thin hands still moved slowly, but there was a new ease in his posture now that he no longer had to push the heavy cart through the streets. Customers had grown accustomed to seeing him there. Some came simply for fruit, others came for conversation. Samuel had never intended to become a familiar face in Charleston, but kindness had a strange way of drawing people together. Children from nearby neighborhoods sometimes stopped by on their way home from school, and Samuel would quietly slip them an extra orange when their parents weren't looking. Maria Lopez still ran the bread stall just a few steps away, her warm laughter often echoing across the market square. Tom Henderson's fish counter continued to fill the morning air with the smell of fresh catch and crushed ice. Jake Miller still stacked vegetables at his stand, his tall frame bending over crates of tomatoes and peppers. The market had returned to normal, or at least something close to it. But not every life in Charleston had moved forward with the same calm. Across the city, Victoria Langford's world had continued exactly as it had before the courtroom hearing. Victoria remained one of the most aggressive real estate executives in Charleston. Her career had always been defined by ambition, speed, and a relentless pursuit of profit. She had built her reputation through sharp negotiations and calculated risks, earning both admiration and quiet resentment from colleagues who often struggled to keep pace with her. One of those colleagues was Michael Grant. Michael Grant was a man in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with neatly trimmed dark hair beginning to show streaks of gray. His calm brown eyes and steady voice made him one of the more respected project managers in Victoria's company. Unlike Victoria, Michael was known for his patience and his careful attention to detail. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood outside Savannah, where his parents had taught him that success meant very little if it came at the expense of other people. On the morning of the accident that would change Victoria's life, Michael had tried to call her twice, but Victoria had been driving. The road stretched along the Charleston waterfront, a busy avenue where early commuters often hurried toward downtown offices. Victoria's silver sedan moved quickly through traffic, the engine humming smoothly beneath the polished hood. Victoria held her phone in one hand, glancing down briefly at a message notification. The moment lasted only a second, but it was enough. Ahead of her, traffic slowed suddenly as a delivery truck pulled partially into the lane. Victoria looked up too late. Her foot slammed on the brakes. The car skidded across the pavement. Metal struck metal with a violent crack. The sound echoed sharply along the street. When the vehicles finally stopped moving, the front of Victoria's sedan had collided heavily with the back of a small delivery van. Inside the van sat a man named Robert Jenkins. Robert Jenkins was 58 years old, a quiet delivery driver who had spent most of his adult life transporting supplies for local grocery stores. His broad frame and weathered hands showed the years he had spent lifting crates and navigating long hours on the road. Robert was known among his co-workers as a patient man who rarely raised his voice and treated every job with the same steady care. That morning, he had simply been doing his route. Now, his van sat damaged at the curb. Police and emergency vehicles arrived quickly. The investigation was simple. Victoria had been distracted while driving. Within weeks, the legal consequences followed. Robert Jenkins filed a civil lawsuit to recover damages for medical expenses and vehicle repairs. Unlike the situation months earlier when Victoria had stood confidently in the courtroom as the plaintiff, this time she entered the courthouse as the defendant. The same courthouse, the same tall limestone building. But the experience felt very different now. Victoria stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, dressed again in a dark, professional suit, yet her posture lacked the same confidence she had once carried. Her pale blue eyes moved across the hallway nervously as lawyers and court clerks passed by. Beside her stood a new attorney, a young woman named Karen Ellis. Karen Ellis was 32 years old, slim and serious with dark hair pulled into a tight bun behind her head. Her sharp features and focused eyes suggested someone who approached every legal challenge with determination. Karen had built her early career handling defense cases for corporate clients, and though she was intelligent and capable, even she could see that the circumstances surrounding Victoria's accident were not in her client's favor. Inside the courtroom, the case unfolded quickly. The evidence was clear. Victoria had been driving carelessly. The damage to the van and the medical expenses were significant. When the judge announced the financial compensation Victoria would be required to pay, the number was far larger than the one she had once demanded from Samuel Carter. Victoria listened silently. For the first time in her life, she stood in a courtroom without control. The judge's decision was final. As she left the courthouse, Victoria paused briefly at the top of the steps. The sunlight outside felt harsh against her eyes. For a moment, she remembered another courtroom hearing months earlier. Another old man standing quietly before a judge. Another situation where she had refused mercy. Now she understood something she had not understood before: how small a person could feel while waiting for someone else to decide their future. Meanwhile, life in the Charleston market moved peacefully forward. Samuel Carter's fruit stand had become one of the most familiar corners of the market square. People knew exactly where to find him each morning beneath the striped awning. On one clear autumn morning, the air crisp and golden with early sunlight, Samuel stood behind the counter, arranging apples into neat pyramids. Lillian Carter had begun visiting the market occasionally now that her health had improved. She sat comfortably on a wooden chair beside the stall, a soft shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The gentle breeze lifted the edges of her silver hair as she watched the customers move through the market. Samuel looked healthier too. The years still showed in his thin frame and lined face, but the worry that once shadowed his expression had softened. Footsteps approached the stall. Samuel looked up and smiled. Daniel Brooks stood there, a stack of books tucked beneath one arm as usual. The young law student looked slightly older now, his confidence growing quietly with each passing month. His calm eyes still carried the thoughtful focus that had first led him to stand in the courtroom that day. "Morning, Mr. Carter," Daniel said. Samuel reached for a small paper bag. "2 apples?" Daniel laughed softly. "You know me too well." Samuel placed the apples inside the bag and handed it across the counter. Then, without saying anything, he added a 3rd apple. Daniel noticed immediately. He raised an eyebrow. Samuel shrugged. "Habit." Daniel smiled. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "you're still paying me back." Samuel blinked in confusion. "I am?" Daniel nodded. "Every day." Samuel leaned slightly closer. "How?" Daniel lifted the bag of apples. "By continuing to live the way you do." Samuel looked at him for a moment, unsure what to say. Daniel's voice softened. "Kindness has a way of spreading, Mr. Carter." Samuel's eyes drifted across the market. Maria laughing behind her bread stall. Tom arguing loudly with a seafood supplier. Jake stacking crates of fresh vegetables. Lillian watching quietly beside him. The sunlight warmed the small fruit stand beneath the striped awning. And in that quiet moment, the old fruit seller understood something simple and powerful. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could travel farther than anyone expected. Story lesson and reflection. Sometimes the most powerful lessons in life do not come from victories or success. They come from quiet moments when ordinary people choose kindness over pride and compassion over judgment. Samuel Carter did not have wealth, influence, or power. He had only a small fruit stand, a sick wife he loved deeply, and the dignity of a man who refused to become bitter even when life treated him unfairly. Yet his story reminds us of something important. A person does not need money to live with honor. What truly defines us is how we treat others, especially those who cannot defend themselves. Victoria Langford believed success meant control, status, and winning every argument. But life has a way of teaching lessons that money cannot prevent. When she finally stood on the other side of the courtroom, she experienced the same fear and uncertainty that Samuel once faced. Sometimes the greatest teacher is simply being placed in another person's position. And then there was Daniel Brooks. He did not step forward because he was rich or powerful. He stepped forward because he understood something simple. When we see injustice and remain silent, the world becomes colder. But when one person chooses courage and compassion, it can change more lives than we realize. In our daily lives, we face smaller versions of these choices every day. We see someone struggling. We hear someone being treated unfairly. We watch people being judged because of their background, their race, or their situation. In those moments, we can look away, or we can choose to stand up quietly like Daniel did. Kindness does not always require grand gestures. Sometimes it is as simple as helping someone who cannot repay you, speaking with respect, showing patience, remembering that every person you meet carries a story you may never fully understand. This story also reminds us that prejudice and discrimination only create more pain in the world. A society grows stronger when people learn to see dignity in every human being regardless of color, wealth, or status. If this story touched your heart, take a moment today to do one small act of kindness for someone else. You never know how far that kindness might travel. And if you believe that compassion still matters in this world, please share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. Your voice helps this community grow. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, remember to subscribe to the channel so you will not miss future stories that inspire hope and understanding. May God bless you and your family with peace, wisdom, and kindness in your daily life. And if you believe that goodness still has power in this world, write Amen in the comments.